All right. I pressed my button. You pressed yours. And here we are. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. And if this is your first time ever listening, welcome to you. Everyone else, what's up? How is everyone doing today? Me, I'm doing pretty darn good, I have to say. Because I am feeling the spirit of a friendship on this day. I have perhaps my dearest friend on the planet visiting me this weekend. And I want to shout her out. Her name is Sharon, and people who have been to my teacher's class Sangha that I do every week probably know her. And by far, she's one of my favorite people I have ever met. And I don't get to see her very often. And she came to stay with me this weekend. In fact, right now, she's in my backyard painting watercolors with my daughter. And I'm up here in the attic recording with you now. And last night, while we were having dinner, she told a story about when me and Sharon first met back in 2016. And apparently what happened is we met during the week. She had come to one of my classes. And then at the end of the week, when I recorded the intro for the podcast, I shouted her out. I said, shout out to my new friend, Sharon. And she listened that week and just thought that was super cool. And I didn't remember that I had done that I had met somebody for the first time, and then at the end of the week shouted them out, new friend on the podcast. And I love that I did that. And I feel like I'm doing it again now because Sharon will go home tomorrow and she'll probably listen to the podcast while she's driving home, and she'll hear me shouting her out again 7 years later. And I love that cyclical feeling and the through line of friendship. It really is the thing that I've come to value most. What is that? What is real friendship with someone? And I guess there's also like the spirit of friendship, like that you can have, that you can bring to a conversation, whether you know someone already or not, whether they're your friend or not. There's a spirit of friendship, of inviting that with another, that I've really come to value and have hoped to have this show be an example of. And it's very fitting for today's episode, which is very unusual. You see, I am a big fan of Daniel Simpson, who's been on the show several times before. He has a new podcast that he started called Ancient Futures, which I highly recommend. He's put out just a few episodes, but they're all really good. And one of his more recent episodes was a role reversal that he did with someone named Vikramjit Singh. And Vikram had taken Daniel's online course about his book, The Truth About Yoga, I believe. And so Vikram came on Daniel's show to interview him and ask him questions about his work. And there was something so great about it because Vikram came to the conversation with a very intimate understanding of what Daniel was doing. And his questions seemed to enable Daniel to speak about what he was doing in a way that I wasn't when I got him to come on my show. I was like, that was awesome. And also just the conversation that they had was substantively very interesting. I highly recommend everybody listen to it. So in any case, after hearing this episode that Daniel put out, I just sent him a note telling him how great I thought it was and how much I was appreciating the podcast. And he got back to me, thanking me, and then saying that if I ever wanted to have him come on my show and do the same thing for me, that he'd be happy to do it. And I immediately said yes, and then immediately got nervous about it, which was so interesting because I always say the same thing when I invite someone to come on the show, that I like to have it be more of a conversation than an interview, and I prefer not to write out any questions. And for many, I think that can be a somewhat I don't know, nerve-wracking kind of situation where you know you're going to be recorded and you don't have any idea what someone's going to ask you about. And in any case, I got the feeling that I think a lot of other people get when they come on my show, because I was going to be talking with Daniel, and I know he's like ridiculously smart. And also, I didn't realize how familiar he is with the show. And in the end, it just was a really exciting conversation for me. Daniel seemed to really pick up on some things that have been going on with me. And it just made me think about how much doing this show is very personal for me. You know, I've always had me wrapped up in it, and I've often said that I interject myself in these intros and in the conversation so much already. Most of the time, I'm trying to get me out of it. But to have someone like Daniel come on and just hand over the reins to him and let him ask me whatever he wants to ask me about, it felt really liberating and fun. And I think it led to some interesting things that I don't think I've talked about before on the show. So I'm so grateful to Daniel for doing this, and I'm excited to share it with you today. Real quick before we get to it, I have a few announcements. First, I've got some in-person gigs. July 29th in Garden City, New York. September 23rd and 24th, Manchester, England. And we added another date to that trip. September 30th and October 1st, I'm going to be in Dublin, Ireland. That's July 29th in Garden City. September 23rd and 24th, Manchester, England. And September 30th, October 1st in Dublin, Ireland. Let's go! If you're in any of those places, I would love to see you there. You can register now. There is limited space. Also, let me mention that you can still register for my year-long teacher training anytime for half price until August. So if that's something you've been considering and maybe the timing wasn't right, you might consider whether now might be a better time, because that offer is not going to be around forever. You can start anytime for half price until August. You can find out about those in-person gigs and the training and all my other stuff. I've got a lot of other options depending on your resources at the moment. All of my stuff can be found at jbrownyoga.com. Okay. Let's get to it. I feel a little nervous. Why do I feel nervous about this one? I don't know. We'll see. I will touch base with you on the other side, but let's go ahead and listen to Daniel Simpson asking me the questions for a change. Here we are. So sorry again to keep you waiting.
No worries, Jay. Glad you're finally connected.
Yes.
It's funny because you often like to start podcasts talking about the sort of asynchronous nature of conversation. And I was kind of wondering if we were going to do a telepathic one this time, or whether we'd make it at least the two of us in the same spot.
No, I think I just have too many balls in the air and I jotted down the time wrong. But I'm glad that you had some free time today and we were able to still get together.
No worries, no worries. It's a real pleasure to be chatting again, and to be chatting actually this time looking at each other. I know in the past you've done podcasts just with the audio, and like you, I'm staring at the screen too much already, so I kind of like to switch it off sometimes. But also you get a different feeling looking, through the screen at least at each other, even if you're not quite in the same space. So it's a pleasure to be doing that.
I think that's especially true when you have had times to talk with someone, you feel like you know someone a little bit more. It's not just a visual image of someone you feel like you have no connection to. And I certainly feel some connection to you. And let me just quickly say that I'll record an introduction for my listeners to kind of explain how this all came about and what inspired it. I just wanted to say to you how much I was flattered by you suggesting to do it, and how I've certainly been interviewed before, but this feels very different. because I'm such a fan of your work and I've really appreciated your episodes, your new podcast. So I really feel like the idea was to put myself on the hot seat, and I feel like we have certainly accomplished that today. So with that, I'm happy to kind of turn the reins over to you.
Well, thank you, Jay. I mean, I should return the compliments. I'm only really doing this because you do what you do. Yours is the only yoga podcast I really listen to, and I've been listening since you started, which is now a very long time ago. And I guess, therefore, the first question that pops into my head is, did you ever imagine when you set out in 2015 hosting a chat with your friend Josh that you would be still at it 8 years later?
I think that I had a plan that it was going to be a long-term project. In fact, anytime you try to educate yourself about podcasting, which I did before I started it, if you go listen to people doing podcasts about podcasting and you try to get information about how to have a successful podcast, everyone tells you that it's a long game. And I think that I had been doing my blog for the better part of a decade. So I took it on as just a practice for myself, like a meditation or a practice to keep myself learning in a sense. So I always saw it as a long-term project, but I don't think I could have foresaw what it would have become or the role that it would have played in my life.
I mean, as you've often said when you've talked about it, through the podcast itself, and a couple of times I've heard you, speak about its genesis, that it really was a continuation of the blogging process. And as blogs kind of petered out in an interactive kind of way, this was an opportunity to actually continue the dialogue that didn't seem to happen on Facebook.
It's true. I think that when I first started doing some writing, in fact, if I go back to my earliest blog post, I believe there was one that was called Hanumanasana is Overrated. And basically, it was a piece about...
Always had an eye for the clickbait then.
It was definitely for clickbait because it was a blogging time. We were all finding clickbaity titles. But I think that it was a response to an article that I had read in Yoga Journal magazine that I just felt wasn't very substantive or nuanced. And I wanted there to be more of that. And someone said, well, then you should write it. And I was like, well, that's a good idea. So the idea was always to have more nuance and more in-depth considerations. Of course, the blog, I started out doing 800 words, and it ended up being somewhere between 800 and 1,000 words each month. But over time, with the advent of social media, initially there were those common threads on Facebook that were very exciting and cool. And it felt like there was a lot going on the internet for yoga, and it was a very exciting time. But as it progressed, at a certain point, there was that algorithm shift, which I think we may have talked about on my show the first time you came on when we were talking about media and journalism and stuff.
The polarization and the mess that creates,
There was a algorithm reprogram at some point, at which point it just felt like everything got shorter and smaller, and 800 words was too much to ask people to read. It seemed like people weren't reading and engaging with text in the same way. And podcasting was something that I had just gotten into. I was listening to podcasts, and it was a better way to fill my time than being on social media or watching YouTube videos. And I thought, wow, podcasting really felt like the more exciting medium. It felt like old radio, where you have people Joe Rogan, people doing these super long form conversations. And I thought that's where I think I could find more nuance than I can in an 800-word blog post.
And you've said as well at the beginning, that you were turning to the people who you knew and almost, trying to construct a bit of an oral history of how things came to be the way that they are. And then, obviously over time, we're now into the 300 and something conversation. And I guess I wonder how you keep finding new people to talk to. What is the organizing ethos really behind the podcast?
That's a pretty funny question. I'm not sure how to answer it. What I would say is that, yes, when I first started doing the podcast, and if someone goes back to the early episodes and listens to those rambling, slightly embarrassing intros I was doing, it was about trying to make sense of how I got to where I was in sort of the yoga scene, because I had as I've often said, rode the wave of yoga into the mainstream, started teaching in the early 90s, right before it kind of started becoming more aware in our popular culture. And, when I started out, I was in my early 20s. I was a bachelor, just like living in some apartment in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. I didn't need to make a lot of money. And, when I started the podcast, it was like 20 years later. I had a yoga center that was closing down after 10 years because I couldn't afford the rent anymore. I was married with 2 kids. And I was like, how did I even get here? So initially it was like wanting to kind of trace yoga coming from the East to the West. And like my teachers who had like come into it in the 60s or early 70s and like taken these meccas to India, met these gurus and come back and like set up a storefront in the East Village. And there was an altar with like pictures of these teachers on there, and I was just trying to make sense of what I learned and where it came from. And also, which I know is the topics of your work quite a bit, actually. That's sort of the inspiration. But also, it was also wanting to kind of tear down what I felt was a bit of an edifice of like what a yoga teacher was there, because we had like the Instagramification of yoga. And so there was all this like hashtag living my best life yoga teachers, like presenting this image of a yoga body and a certain lifestyle. And here I was like struggling and with a lot of physical pain, because most yoga teachers who are teaching certain styles where they have to be on performance all the time, it's not sustainable for a person's body. At least it wasn't for me. So everything was kind of breaking down and I wanted to like expose it. So a lot of those raw intros were like, hey, this is bullshit, y'all. Most of the yoga teachers I know have pain and are not like all blissful beings. And we should be honest about that,
Well, I've always really appreciated that dimension to the way that you put yourself out there. You do, hang out there warts and all and say, here it is, like it or lump it. And, obviously some people, find that's not to their taste and they give you, a hard time for talking over your interviewees or whatever it might be, or saying too much about yourself. But, in a way, you, as you've just said, are trying to tell the story of what it means to be a yoga teacher without, over finessing it. And even to the point of talking about, the business side of it. Obviously, you decided social media wasn't really the place to hang out, but starting a podcast is an alternative form of social media. It's reaching people, but with a more rich offering of something that they might gain something from, rather than have something taken away from their pockets with. And I quite like that approach to being honest about the sharing while actually sharing something substantive, and it's free and people can tune in, and if they get something from it, great. So that's been rich. But when it comes to sharing about yourself, I wonder, sometimes, especially when you start talking a lot about your family, how they feel about this degree of sharing that you do in public. What do they say when they hear some of the stuff that goes out, or do they just not tune in?
Well, first of all, let me make a comment to something you just said previously about interrupting people. I would say that that's something I really learned. I learned how to listen a lot better, because in the early episodes, as you know, having started a show, there's kind of a nervousness around, are we going to have enough to talk about, or like to keep the conversation moving? So a lot of times I don't think I was listening very well, and listening back to myself, interrupting people and having people email me and be like, yo, stop interrupting your guests, man, definitely taught me some things about how to listen better, which was a good thing. And I will say also, to the idea of the podcast being a form of social media, I didn't see it like that when I started out, but it certainly became that. And I did make a conscious choice to get off of social media at a certain point, and it did become my form of social media. So to all of that. Now, in terms of my family and how they feel about the like crazy oversharing that I sometimes have done over the years. First of all, my wife, we've been together for quite a long time. So I was doing that in the blog too. And so she had gotten kind of used to that in me. She knew that that was something that I was doing. And I remember having conversations with her back during the blog days where she would read the blog. She's like, I can't believe you're just going to send this out and let everybody read this. And I told her, I said, this is how I'm keeping myself in check in certain ways, that kind of transparency. I've taught about that was a way to make sure that I wasn't full of it, or that I was being everything that I would hope to be as a yoga teacher and a person. So she, I think, understands why I do that. I think over the years of doing the podcast, there have been a couple occasions where, you know, she questioned me doing it. But, you know, at this point, my wife supports me and respects what I'm doing. And I think she's seen the positive results, even though there have been times where it's really caused us some issues. I think in terms of my daughters, they know a little bit. They've each recorded an episode with me, and I posted it, and they've enjoyed that. And I think that they seem to recognize that there's something a little bit different about me than some of the other dads, and I like that. Yeah. So in general, they're supportive, and, you know, they trust me to do what I feel like is the right thing for me to be doing.
Do you mind if I ask which incidents, did cause a bit of friction?
Yeah, I think that there were, two occasions where there were kind of scandals that I got embroiled into. Mm-hmm. And in those occasions, I don't think it was the oversharing that was the problem so much as that because I put myself out there in the ways that I have, it made me very vulnerable to like the downsides of social media and the internet too. So when there were like concerted campaigns kind of like against me and like people who don't even normally listen to my show were hearing about, or like it got back to my wife from like other people, like, oh my God, I heard this thing about Jay, and she had a lot of anxiety about it because it was very scary kind of thing. That was a moment where I was like, oh man, I've made my family vulnerable too. And it's not just me. And I had to kind of reconcile that. But having said that, all in all, I don't think that my wife has ever regretted it. I think, again, my wife met me always having been this way, always having done this. So for her to like be upset about it now, it doesn't make any sense,
I hear you. No. I'm curious though about this tendency to get embroiled in controversy, because it's not just a one-off. And I actually discovered if I typed your blog URL into Google, the SEO text comes up and it describes you as outspoken and sometimes controversial, as if you're almost wearing it as a badge of pride. I mean, it's honesty again, radical honesty, but you sometimes actually actively seek out controversy, whether consciously or not, do you think?
I think that I've always wanted to be a bit provocative, that it always felt like in the early days, it seemed like nobody was having conversations about stuff, and I wanted to provoke them. And it was in that earlier punky, clickbaity time in the internet. So some of that outspokenness was kind of like a marketing angle in a way to kind of get noticed, I think. Yeah. Over time, I think I haven't wanted to shy away from what felt to me like the most important conversations we should be having. And as I said, sometimes there's this thing of yoga teachers when it comes to needing to put ourselves out there in the market of like always putting forth like this best picture of success or something. And I wanted, as I said, to kind of tear that down. So I don't know. I might have lost my train of thought on your question a little bit.
Well,
remind me what you were asking about. Oh, the controversy. I think sometimes it's just like a punky nature in me wanting to stir things up. I've certainly matured in that, and I'm way more careful now because I can see that there can be sort of harm that happens from it. Where I think in the past I wanted to stir up. Like if someone came on the show, I would almost take a more adversarial role in the conversation sometimes, especially if I didn't agree with that person on certain things. And I would want to kind of like spice it up, which in certain ways works. Like you will get more attention. What I learned is you can do that. You can do things just to kind of make controversy and get more reach and have more people pay attention. But a lot of the people paying attention don't like you. Like you draw attention that you don't necessarily want. You take attention for attention's sake. I found to not be fruitful, not for my business and not for my soul. So I think now I'm just smarter and not interested in creating any adversarial relationships. Even if I do disagree with someone, I want to feel like I can connect with them and that there can be like a base of friendship, even if we see things in very different ways, especially nowadays with so much polarization. That's become a bit of a new part of the mission of the show, is to be able to talk to anybody, even if we see things very differently, and find a mutual ground to come together on wherever possible.
And have there been any conversations since that shift in your perspective where you have, really found yourself quite strongly disagreeing with somebody, but then bitten your tongue and then got off the call and vented to someone else about it rather than letting it all come out on the air? I'm just curious how you manage that as somebody who's having all these conversations with such a wide variety of people who sometimes surely must just, yank your chain in some way or another.
I appreciate that question. I would say it doesn't happen very often, partially because going back to a question that you asked before that I didn't answer in terms of like, what's the genesis? Like how do I come up with all these episodes, or have I managed to maintain some consistency of doing a weekly show for 7+ years at this point?
Exactly. Yeah.
I would say that, and it's the funny thing to say, a lot of it is a bit of an intuitive, like I don't feel like I'm doing it all myself. That I do feel like certain conversations are just kind of like, even this one, I didn't plan for this. It just kind of came about in a very natural way. I'm kind of putting out feelers and listening and pulling on certain threads. Sometimes I get an email from someone. I do have like an ongoing file of suggestions that people have made or ideas that I have. And if I'm like, ooh, I got to schedule some episodes, I'll like dip into that file and send out some invites. But again, you never really know who's going to take you up on it or not. And it is kind of a process of it unfolding in and of itself. And I found that when I let the episodes kind of unfold and I'm not trying to like create the content in a way, I'm letting it just be a natural part of my own inquiry and practice and where that's leading me. Then I don't find myself in situations where I'm in conversation with people where I'm like, ooh, and I want to say something and I'm biting my tongue. It has happened recently. I hesitate to like point to the exact episode because I don't know.
It's a general flavor.
I don't know if I want to do that, but there has been a recent instance where someone came on the show and they were expressing some views about something. And I did want to challenge them on it. And I decided not to. And afterward, I kind of was like, ooh, did I pull the punch? Did I not stick to the mission of the show? Did I softball that person too much, And I realized that no, I felt like it was the right choice because I wanted to build a bridge. And there was a very good chance that if I had challenged that guest on that one thing, that it would have been, I think it would have been viewed by many people as hostile. And that was not what I wanted to do I wanted to have a good faith dialogue about it, but I feared it wasn't going to be perceived as such. So I bit my tongue. I did talk it out. I have a weekly teachers sangha where I have people who come in and we usually talk about what's going on the podcast. And I did share with them on the down low that week. I was like, I got to talk about this. Do you think? And people generally agreed that they thought I made the right choice because there was so much other things in the talk that were valuable and good. To challenge that on that one little thing and potentially kind of sully all the other great things about it. That's the kind of maturing that I think I've come to, where I'm not just going to jump on any little thing that might stir something up. I want to try to find what the heart and soul of the conversation is and just be true to that.
I hear you, and it's something I can really relate to since I started podcasting. I'm talking to people who have got different views, and sometimes it's even a question for me: should I be talking to this person because I'm implicitly endorsing their views by sharing them? And so, to a certain extent, the adversarial dimension of the conversation has to creep in. I mean, it's not really arisen in any of the episodes I put out so far, but I'm talking to people all the time about trying to have a conversation and trying to identify for myself, I suppose, where my boundaries lie, and where we can find an area of common ground. Because I wholeheartedly agree that there's just far too much discord in the general culture of communication these days. That's what makes for viewings. It's what makes for algorithmic satisfaction for the big tech companies, and it's what makes for confusion for the rest of us. So anything that we can do to sort of counteract that tendency, I think, is healthy. But then I also ask myself another question, which I really want to ask you, which is, how much am I guided by what matters to me? And how much do I care about what other people think? So I'm wondering how much you care about what your listeners think.
I certainly care. Like, I want people to get something from it, but I've learned that I can't even, that doesn't enter into the process of making it, really, because I really don't know what people are going to like and what they don't like. In fact, there have been a couple occasions. There was one very infamous episode where it's the only time in all the years I've done it where after the episode, and I could actually mention this one, was one with Keno McGregor, where I, after recording it, was like, I don't think we should post this. Like, I thought that it was kind of super uncomfortable. I was incredibly uncomfortable while we were doing it. I look back on it now and I think I would do it totally different now, given everything that's happened and what I know differently. But at the time, I felt really uncomfortable about it. And my producer, Josh, insisted. He's like, no, this is really good. He thought it was an example of two teachers, like holding their ground and having different viewpoints. And he thought it was exciting and a good episode. And it did prove to be like a valuable episode. But your point is well made, that there is a kind of a boundary to set for yourself. I think I don't subscribe to this notion of like, don't have someone on because you're platforming them. I've come to move away from that idea. Even if somebody has views that are, I don't know, far out or difficult, or a lot of people disagree with, I still think it should be okay to talk to them. And I also know that people will say then, okay, if you bring someone like on, then you have to challenge them in a certain way. And, I guess I do think that if I'm going to bring someone on who I know there are questions about, I'm going to bring it up, but I'm going to, again, try to do it in a way that's not adversarial. I'm not going to try to like bring someone on to take them down. I'm going to bring someone on to try to understand their viewpoint potentially. And, I think that is a risk worth taking, because like we said, there is a big divide in terms of what people feel like they can talk about and not. And I feel like podcasts are where those divides are sometimes being bridged.
I agree with you. It's an opportunity to bypass, the filters that normally control what's on the airwaves. And, so we can talk about anything, and that is a great opportunity. And, I appreciate in a way the evolution of your thinking on that. I remember actually there was a time when, this sort of wave of guru abuse revelations was coming up, that you sort of felt duty bound to put the point, particularly to teachers of Ashtanga, what are they going to say about their guru? And, that was perhaps one of the flashpoints that got you, a certain amount of stick, some of those conversations. And then by contrast, the other extreme, I suppose, when you had Katyananda on and, we're talking about, gender critical feminism and various perspectives around that must have got you probably the sort of stick that you were alluding to when your wife was raising some concerns, because I imagine you got a lot of it for that. And, fair enough to still say, I think it's important to be able to have a conversation, because I do think in light of, some of the ways that conversations are policed, there is an increasing tendency to avoid talking about certain subjects at all. Obviously, then we have to question how we talk about them, but that's a different topic. The idea that anything, as you say, should be just off limits per se, unless you say one particular thing, is, I think, unhelpful for our understanding of the world, because that's a sort of gradual narrowing of the perspective to fit somebody else's suggestion of what the script is. And, we all need to have space to inquire. That is actually the essence of yoga. But some might say, does all that stuff belong on a yoga podcast? Which I think is still a relevant question.
It certainly is. And, that specific instance that you're pointing to, I would say is the most inflection point for the show in regards to what we're talking about. At the time, I stumbled into that not really knowing what I was stumbling into. Kachi was my first yoga teacher, and she was the person who taught me about inclusivity and awareness around LGBT issues back in the early 90s. She had a yoga center in San Francisco, and she was the person who turned me on to kind of those liberal values in certain ways. And so when I kind of caught wind on social media that she was kind of being in this situation and people were going after her, I wanted to talk to her to understand that. And it wasn't until after we recorded it and posted it, and she warned me, she's like, what's going to happen. And I was like, no, I do this all the time. I've been in controversies. No worries. I didn't have any idea, but it was really intense. And, the main issue there was the call to delete the episode. That was the only thing I didn't feel comfortable to do. I was like, I'll talk to anybody. I had someone on 2 weeks later to talk about the episode. I was like, I'll do. And there was a whole list of things that people had told me that I would need to do to kind of repair the damage, as they say. And I did all of those things except delete it. It became like you said, the only thing I really had was sort of the independence of the situation and the idea that we couldn't have that conversation, even if there was problems with it, even if I could have been better prepared or whatever it was. The comment threads that led, and there was really one particular note that someone sent me that sold me on it, which is to this day why I never deleted it. I got a message from a parent of a trans kid saying, I know people are coming after you and telling you to delete the episode. Please don't delete the episode. I'm a yoga teacher too. I think it's important for me to understand where someone like Kachi's coming from. We need to be able to learn from each other, even if we don't agree. These conversations are valuable. Please don't delete them. And I just thought, okay, I'm not going to delete it. And so, it's from there, I would say I've certainly educated myself on that particular topic. And it does go to something you said of, does this even belong on a yoga podcast? I don't think that I'm interested in necessarily, we're kind of doing it now, but I'm not interested in having conversations about these hotbed flashpoint issues, that I think that there's a way to get to the heart of some of these conversations without them having to be rooted in identity politics, because it just seems to me too often the way that the conversations are framed are designed to put us at odds with other people. So yoga to me is a way of finding the commonalities and the universalities and not pitting people against each other. So I think I'm clearer on that. And like I said, were I to have someone on the show who expressed views like that again, I think I could handle it much better now than I did then. But I don't regret leaving it up for other people to hear it and to see the comment threads that came from it, because I thought it was a learning experience for me and for listeners.
And you described that, I think, as learning in public. I can't remember if it was in relation to that incident or a previous one. But obviously that's part of the process. If you're going to get into hot water, to not just sort of make it all go away, scrub it from the internet, pretend it never happened. People can still form their own opinion, and in a way, that's what you're arguing for. And we do live in a culture that's supposed to value free speech, so. The suggestion that the answer to speech you don't like is to shut it down is, I think, antithetical to the idea of free speech. So I agree on that level. But let's move on to a slightly different angle, because obviously you get it in the neck from various different perspectives. And a couple of times you've had it from that sort of social justice orientation. Another one that seems to have been quite consistent over the years is let's say traditionalists about yoga lineage and where things come from, and effectively whether or not you're a culturally appropriating, commercializing white guy who's stealing yoga from its true source. How do you feel about all that?
I think that I've certainly had moments when the conversation came up, when it first really got into the sphere and we were talking about cultural appropriation. Like many sincere practitioners, I questioned, am I doing that? Am I being respectful of the cultures in which this comes from? And I think there was a time where I sort of tapered back on the amount of chanting I would do in class. In fact, I had one occasion where I taught a workshop, and I just, as part of the ritual of the practices that I facilitate, because this is what I learned, I always did a little chant at the beginning and I would do a chant at the end. And it wasn't like call and response. I invited people to join me if they wanted, but it was just part of the ritual for me, because that's what I learned. And there was this one workshop where someone who was of Indian descent but wasn't born in India, I think, got up in protest and walked out while I was chanting. She thought it was inappropriate and she was upset about that, and she left. And I was devastated. I just felt like, oh my God, I just hadn't had that happen. And that viewpoint of someone saying, hey, I don't think it's right for a white guy to be chanting these Sanskrit mantras from my culture, from my childhood, without the context that it should have, I took it to heart. I will say that I felt like, and I talk about this on the show, I did get kind of a message where it was maybe a week later and I was at my center and these two women came in. It was a mother and a grandmother, and they were from India visiting their kids. And they took my class and I did the same exact chant and they came up to me afterwards with hugs to tell me how much they appreciated it and how much they felt the spirit of their country was, they were very lovely and complimentary that I was doing that I was offering this chant in Brooklyn and that they could come and have it with me. So there was that kind of counterpoint. And I do think that because I'm so inspired by TKV Deskachar, who was very clear on this matter and said, take this and make it your own, make it relevant to your culture and to your life. That was the clear instruction given. So I always felt very emboldened by that, and felt that I was being true to what my practice was and what I had learned, and was always citing where I got things from. That transparency that we've talked about was my way of making sure that I was being as true as I can to it, to say, this is where I got this from. This is why I hold this value, and to present it in a way that wasn't dogmatic or that I'm an authority felt like the most appropriate role for me to take as a teacher.
I hear you. And, in some ways, all of us in the Western world are, by default post-lineage, unless we actually have a guru. And it's been that way since yoga became popular 50 odd years ago for the first time, because people might have, in a very few rare cases, actually been directly apprenticed to, the teacher who was seen as the root guru of that particular postural yoga lineage, although we could argue even if whether they're really yoga lineages as such. But vast majority of people just have learned this mishmash of, vaguely ancient practices which have got a distinctly modern tinge to them, and found what works and run with it and done their best to then try to reintegrate that into some cultural context that makes sense to us. And actually, that's what a lot of the Indian teachers have been doing themselves. And, this is the sort of rich mix in which we've been, wallowing the last couple of times I've had a nice chat with you about all this stuff. And I suppose that leads me to the third realm of potential criticism is, sometimes people get their knickers in a twist about what's properly yoga from the Western perspective. They've studied a lot. They've got a sense of what comes from where. And anybody who's a bit cowboy and Wild West and making it all up for themselves rather than aligning themselves strictly, even in your case with purely the Desikachar lineage rather than your take on it, they might say, well, this isn't serious. This is shallow. It's not proper yoga. This is supermarket yoga rather than the real deal. And they might even zero in on the title of the podcast and say, Yoga Talks, Yoga Chittavritti Nirodha. You should be silent. Sit down, shut up, turn off the podcast. Yeah. So how do you feel about this sort of tension between talking about ideas and the reality of practice, which is to be quiet?
Well, I appreciate that. I do think that there's a long tradition of dialogue and debate and inquiry in yoga. I don't think that yoga has just been about trying to be silent. If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.